Good evening and welcome back to Drift Through History. There are moments in history where everything that came before seems to have been quietly arranging itself into position for a single point of decision, where decades of tension and rivalry and religious conflict and imperial ambition compress themselves into a few weeks, a few battles, a few storms, and then release, and the world that comes out the other side is permanently different from the world that went in. Tonight we are talking about one of those moments. The summer of 1588, when the largest naval force ever assembled in the history of Christendom sailed up the English Channel toward the coast of England, and the outcome of those weeks determined which version of the early modern world would get to exist, whether the Protestant Reformation would survive as a permanent rearrangement of European religious life, or whether Catholic Spain, the most powerful state on earth, would succeed in rolling it back and returning the Atlantic world to a single religious order under Habsburg dominance. No pressure. The story of the Spanish Armada is usually told as England's story. The plucky island kingdom, outnumbered and outgunned, somehow turning back the Colossus. And England's story is part of it, genuinely. But the fuller story is richer and stranger than that framing suggests, because the Armada was not only a story about England. It was the product of 30 years of accumulated grievance, religious passion, dynastic calculation, and strategic overconfidence on the Spanish side, and its failure was not primarily a triumph of English valour, though there was English valour in it. It was a failure produced by a combination of flawed planning, bad weather, tactical rigidity, and the particular way that very large, very expensive undertakings tend to collapse when the assumptions that justified them turn out to be wrong. Understanding all of that, the full weight of why it happened and why it failed in the way it failed, is what tonight is for. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments, because knowing that this story is settling over different latitudes at the same moment is something I always find quietly wonderful. Now dim the lights, let the room soften, maybe turn on a fan for that low background hum. Find a comfortable position and let the breath slow down. You have nowhere to be. And let us go back to a Spain at the absolute height of its power, and to the peculiar chain of events that led it to attempt the most ambitious military operation of the 16th century. The Spain that Philip II ruled in the 1580s was the most powerful state in the world, and its power was of a kind that had no precedent in European history. Spain controlled not merely the Iberian Peninsula, but the entirety of the Americas that had been explored and claimed by the middle of the 16th century. The silver mines of Peru and Mexico, the plantation economies of the Caribbean, the trade routes of the Pacific that connected the Americas to the Philippines, and through the Philippines to the spice trade of Asia. The annual treasure fleets that brought silver from the New World to Seville were the financial engine of the Habsburg Empire, providing revenues that allowed Philip to maintain the largest and best-equipped military force in Europe, the Spanish tercios, the heavy infantry formations that had been the most feared and most effective soldiers in the world since the Italian wars of the early 16th century. He ruled not only Spain but Portugal, which had fallen to him in 1580 when the Portuguese royal line died out, and Philip pressed a dynastic claim that his army made irresistible. He ruled the Spanish Netherlands, the wealthy commercial provinces of what are now Belgium and the Netherlands, or was trying to, because the Dutch provinces had been in open revolt against Spanish authority since 1568, and the War of Suppression was consuming Spanish resources with a thoroughness that was beginning to strain even the silver-backed finances of the Habsburg state. Philip himself was a man whose personal qualities were almost precisely calibrated to be misread by posterity. He was widely portrayed in English Protestant propaganda as a cruel, fanatical tyrant, which was politically useful to England, and bore a family resemblance to the truth, but was not the whole truth. He was in fact a man of considerable personal piety, extraordinary administrative diligence. He was famous for reading every document himself and annotating it in the margins, a governing style that combined admirable conscientiousness with the practical limitation that it made the entire decision-making apparatus of the world's largest empire dependent on the personal attention of a single man who was not always well, and a genuinely complex relationship to the use of force. He did not enjoy violence as an instrument of policy. He preferred diplomacy and economic pressure when they could be made to work. He turned to military operations when he had persuaded himself that they were both necessary and, in the larger providential framework of his deeply held Catholic faith, divinely authorized. The Armada was, in his understanding, not an act of aggression, but an act of obligation, a project that God had assigned to the most Catholic king, and that God would therefore cause to succeed if Philip fulfilled his responsibilities faithfully. This theology of providential authorization was not unique to Philip. It was the common currency of 16th century political religion on all sides. Elizabeth I of England invoked God's favour for the Protestant cause with the same confidence that Philip invoked it for the Catholic one, and both of them had enough genuine faith to believe what they were saying. The difference was that Philip was planning a specific military operation, while Elizabeth was managing a defensive situation, and the difference in what each of them needed from God was therefore different. Philip needed God to cause the operation to succeed despite its difficulty, while Elizabeth needed God to cause the operation to fail despite its evident strength. In the event, what actually happened combined elements of both, and cannot be attributed cleanly to either divine favour or simple military analysis. The man at the centre of it all, Philip II, working in his small study at the Escorial, with the window looking into the church, was one of the most conscientious and most overworked rulers in European history, and understanding him properly changes the story of the Armada from a tale of arrogant miscalculation into something more interesting and more tragic. He was not a man who launched the Armada out of blind pride. He launched it after years of careful deliberation, having exhausted the alternatives, having consulted his advisers and his theologians and his financial officers, and having concluded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized everything he did that it was both necessary and, with God's cooperation, achievable. His counterpart in England, Elizabeth I, was an entirely different kind of political intelligence. Where Philip governed by documentation, by the paper trail of dispatches and memoranda, and annotated reports that he kept in perfect order and that have survived in the Simancas archive in a quantity that staggers even experienced historians. Elizabeth governed primarily through personal relationships, through the face-to-face management of her court and her council, through the theatrical deployment of her personality, in the service of political objectives that she pursued with a consistency that her studied informality deliberately concealed. She was, her advisers and enemies alike recognized, exceptionally intelligent in ways that could not always be distinguished from stubbornness, and exceptionally capable of maintaining simultaneously contradictory positions, encouraging Drake's raids while denying responsibility for them, maintaining negotiations with Spain while covertly supporting the Dutch rebels, that Philip found exasperating and that her own government found difficult, but that kept England's options open in ways that a more transparent policy would not have. The intelligence network that Francis Walsingham had built in service of Elizabeth's security was one of the instruments of this policy. Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary, her chief intelligence officer, a man of Puritan religious conviction, whose ferocity in pursuit of Catholic plots was both personal and professional, had developed by the 1580s a network of agents across Europe that penetrated the courts and conspiracies of England's enemies with a thoroughness that Philip's own intelligence apparatus, for all its resources, could not match. Walsingham's agents in the Spanish court and the Spanish military administration provided a flow of intelligence about Armada preparations that meant Elizabeth's government was not surprised by the fleet's departure in May 1588. They had been following the preparations for years, Drake's raid on Cadiz the previous year having been partly a demonstration of how much the English knew about where and how the Armada was being organised. The grievances that drove Philip toward the Armada had been accumulating for decades, and tracing them requires going back at least to the break between England and Rome in the 1530s. Henry VIII's decision to divorce Catherine of Aragon, Philip's great-aunt, and establish the Church of England as an institution independent of papal authority, had set England on a trajectory that, through the reigns of the Protestant Edward VI, the Catholic Mary I, and the Protestant Elizabeth I, produced a religious settlement that was, by the 1580s, firmly Protestant and firmly committed to remaining so. Elizabeth's religious settlement of 1559 had established the Church of England on terms broad enough to accommodate a wide range of Protestant opinion, while drawing a clear line against the restoration of papal authority that English Catholics hoped for, and that Philip, as the self-appointed champion of Catholicism in Europe, regarded as both a spiritual duty and a political project. The relationship between Philip and Elizabeth was one of the most complicated bilateral relationships of the 16th century, combining mutual interest, mutual suspicion, religious antagonism, and a residue of personal history. Philip had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary and had briefly been king consort of England. That gave their interactions a quality somewhere between the diplomatic and the deeply personal. For the first 2 decades of Elizabeth's reign, Philip had maintained a degree of restraint in his hostility toward England that had frustrated the more aggressive elements of his court, and the papacy, which periodically urged a crusade against the heretical English queen. His restraint was not affection, it was calculation. England and Spain needed each other as commercial partners. Antagonising England too directly risked pushing Elizabeth into an alliance with France that would be strategically disastrous. And there was always the possibility that internal Catholic pressure, a successful assassination, or the operation of natural mortality would restore England to the Roman Church without the cost and risk of military intervention. What changed in the 1580s was a combination of escalating provocation and escalating desperation on both sides. Elizabeth had been providing covert and eventually overt support to the Dutch rebels since the beginning of their revolt. English volunteers, English money, and eventually in 1585 English troops under the Earl of Leicester, because a Spanish victory in the Netherlands would place the most powerful military force in Europe directly across the Channel from England with no buffer state between them. Francis Drake and other English privateers, operating with varying degrees of official authorization that Elizabeth maintained careful ambiguity about, had been systematically raiding Spanish shipping and Spanish colonial settlements across the Atlantic for years, producing financial damage that Philip's treasury could measure precisely, and that was significant, and a degree of humiliation that a king of Philip's self-understanding could not indefinitely tolerate. And in 1587, Elizabeth had finally done the thing that Philip had been waiting for her to do for 19 years. She had executed Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart's story deserves its own careful telling before we arrive at its role as the trigger for the Armada, because she was one of the most remarkable and most catastrophically unfortunate figures of the 16th century, and her 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner were the long fuse attached to the explosion of 1588. She had been Queen of Scotland at 6 days old when her father James V died, and had spent her childhood at the French court as the promised bride of the French Dauphin, an education that made her thoroughly French in manner and culture, and thoroughly Catholic in religion, and that gave her the particular kind of elegance and ease in courtly settings that made her personally magnetic to everyone who met her, which was inconveniently difficult to deal with for the Protestant English court that was nominally her rival, and periodically her jailer. She became Queen of France in 1559, lost that position when her husband Francis II died in 1560, and returned to Scotland in 1561 as a Catholic queen governing a newly and enthusiastically Protestant country, a situation that would have required extraordinary diplomatic skill even from a monarch of long experience, which Mary was not. She managed Scotland with varying degrees of success for the next 6 years before a sequence of disastrous decisions. Her marriage to the feckless and eventually murdered Lord Darnley, her subsequent marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, who was widely believed to have organised the murder, the Scottish nobles' rebellion that these choices provoked drove her from her throne and across the border into England in 1568, seeking Elizabeth's protection. Elizabeth's response was characteristically oblique. She did not imprison Mary formally, she did not return her to Scotland, she did not allow her to leave England, and she did not resolve the legal and political questions that Mary's presence raised. She simply kept her in one comfortable house or another across the north of England for 19 years. Those 19 years were a continuous management problem for Elizabeth's government. Mary was a Catholic claimant to the English throne, around whom Catholic plots for Elizabeth's assassination and Mary's elevation could organise themselves. She was also personally compelling and politically astute enough to maintain an active correspondence with potential supporters despite her confinement and the various plots that her existence inspired. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, the Babington plot of 1586 were serious enough in their ambition to justify the vigilance that Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Francis Walsingham, devoted to monitoring them. Walsingham's spy network penetrated most of the Catholic plotting around Mary, and the Babington plot of 1586, in which Anthony Babington and a group of Catholic conspirators planned Elizabeth's assassination and Mary's release, was allowed to develop long enough to provide documentary evidence of Mary's involvement before the principals were arrested. The trial that followed, and the execution at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587, were judicial acts that Elizabeth approached with the reluctance of a woman who understood, better than her advisers did, the consequences of killing an anointed queen. She signed the death warrant and then, when the execution had been carried out, expressed fury at the secretary who had dispatched it without her final explicit authorization, a performance of outrage that was partly genuine and partly political, a way of maintaining the position that she had not meant to order the killing quite so definitively. The execution was legal. Mary was found guilty by a legitimate commission under the laws of England. None of that prevented the political consequences that Elizabeth had feared. Mary Stuart's execution in February 1587 was the proximate trigger that converted Philip's existing plans for an armada from a contingency he was contemplating into an urgent project he was prosecuting with everything the Spanish state could provide. Mary had been the Catholic claimant to the English throne, the alternative to Elizabeth, whose existence had provided Catholic plotters with a focus for their schemes, and whose survival had given Philip a reason to prefer Elizabeth's conversion or peaceful removal to her destruction. As long as Mary lived, a Catholic England could be imagined without Philip having to become King of England himself, a prospect that carried with it the complication of having to manage a large Protestant population, and the inconvenience of an already overstretched imperial administration taking on another large, difficult dependency. Mary's death removed that option. If England was to be returned to Catholicism, it would have to be done by force, and the throne, once taken, would either be Philip's or his daughter's, both options requiring a degree of permanent English commitment that his previous planning had carefully avoided. The plan that Philip developed across 1586 and 1587 was called the Enterprise of England, and in its original conception, it was a plan of extraordinary ambition and more than ordinary logistical complexity. A great fleet, the Armada, would sail from Lisbon, the capital of newly acquired Portugal, up through the Atlantic, around the southwestern tip of England, and into the English Channel. It would not attempt a direct landing on the English coast. Instead, it would rendezvous with a large Spanish army, the Army of Flanders, commanded by Philip's brilliant nephew the Duke of Parma, which had been fighting in the Netherlands for years and was the most experienced military force in Europe, that would cross the Channel in flat-bottomed barges from the Flemish coast. The Armada would provide naval cover for this crossing, preventing the English fleet from interfering while Parma's army made its way across and landed on the English coast. The combined force would then march on London. Elizabeth would be deposed. England would be returned to Catholicism. The Netherlands revolt. deprived of its English support and financial lifeline, would collapse. The Protestant challenge to Habsburg dominance of Europe would be resolved. It was on paper a workable plan. It was also a plan that required a degree of coordination between two widely separated forces, the Armada at sea and Parma's army on the Flemish coast, that the communications technology of the 16th century could not reliably achieve, and that made assumptions about the behaviour of the English fleet and the weather in the Channel that proved in the event incorrect. These were not obvious flaws at the planning stage. The Armada was unprecedented in scale. Parma's army was unprecedented in quality. The combination, if it could be made to work, was theoretically sufficient for the task. What the plan lacked was adequate accounting for what would happen if any single element of the coordination failed. The Netherlands and the Army of Flanders deserve more than a passing mention, because they were not merely the staging ground for the enterprise of England. They were one of its primary causes, and the army that was supposed to do the actual work of conquering England was the most formidable military force in Europe. Understanding both requires going back to the beginning of the Dutch Revolt. The 17 provinces of the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg of today, had been under Habsburg rule since Charles V inherited them at the beginning of the 16th century, and they were among the most economically valuable territories in Europe, whose wool trade, shipping and banking made their cities among the richest in the world. The revolt that began in 1566 was driven by a combination of religious grievance. The spread of Calvinism through the northern provinces had been met by Philip's determined and often brutal effort to suppress Protestant heresy, and political resistance to the increasingly centralised and increasingly Spanish character of the Habsburg administration. The Duke of Alba, whom Philip sent to suppress the revolt in 1567, with an army of 10,000 Spanish and Italian veterans, established a Council of Troubles that executed several thousand people in its first years of operation, and earned in the process the name by which most Netherlanders called it, the Council of Blood. The severity that Alba applied produced not suppression but intensification of the revolt, as communities that had been wavering in their resistance were radicalised by the systematic violence of the Spanish repression. By the 1580s, the northern provinces, Holland, Zeeland and their neighbours, the core of what would become the Dutch Republic, had been fighting Spain for nearly 20 years and had not been subdued. They had developed a military and naval establishment of considerable capability, funded by the commercial wealth of Amsterdam and the other great Dutch trading cities, and led by the House of Orange with a political sophistication that repeatedly frustrated the Spanish commanders sent to destroy them. The Duke of Parma, Alessandro Farnese, Philip's nephew, and one of the most gifted commanders of the age, had been making steady progress in reconquering the southern provinces through the early 1580s using a combination of military force and careful political management that gave reconquered cities terms generous enough to make resistance seem less attractive than accommodation. By 1585 he had recovered Antwerp, the greatest commercial city in the Netherlands, and had the northern provinces under increasing pressure. It was this army, battle-hardened, expertly led, numerically substantial, that Philip intended to use as the instrument of England's conquest. The plan required Parma to hold his veterans in readiness along the Flemish coast, ready to embark the moment the Armada arrived to clear the Channel. But the Dutch flyboats that blockaded the Flemish harbours were the obstacle that neither Philip's planning nor Medina Sidonia's navigation could overcome, and Parma's perfect army was never in a position to cross, because the naval situation never provided the window the crossing required. The man Philip chose to command the Armada was himself a product of this planning difficulty. The obvious choice would have been the Marquis of Santa Cruz, Spain's most distinguished admiral, who had won the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the great naval victory over the Ottoman fleet that was the defining naval engagement of the 16th century before the Armada, and who had drawn up the original plans for the enterprise of England with the professional competence of a man who had spent his life at sea. Santa Cruz died in February 1588, exhausted by the preparations and by a campaign against English raids in the Azores. Philip replaced him with Alonso Pérez de Guzmán el Bueno, the 7th Duke of Medina Sidonia, who was the grandest nobleman in Spain and one of the least naval of men. Medina Sidonia wrote to Philip when the appointment was announced, in a letter whose honesty was remarkable given the political context, explaining that he had no experience of the sea or of naval warfare, that he was prone to seasickness, and that he was not the right man for the job. Philip replied that God would provide what human experience lacked, which was either the expression of genuine faith or of a determination to proceed that no amount of sensible objection was going to deflect. Medina Sidonia accepted the appointment, organised himself with the administrative thoroughness of a man who could not be brave about the sea, but could be meticulous about everything else, and sailed. The English preparations for what most observers believed was coming had been underway for years with varying degrees of urgency. Elizabeth's government understood the threat well enough, but was characteristically constrained in its response by the same factor that constrained most of Elizabeth's strategic decisions: money. The Queen's fiscal conservatism was a function partly of temperament and partly of the structural reality that England's revenues were a fraction of Spain's, and that any serious military expenditure had to be justified to a parliament that controlled the purse strings and that shared the Queen's instinct for financial caution. The English fleet that would face the Armada was not purely a royal fleet. It was a combination of royal warships, the Queen's ships, maintained in varying states of readiness by the naval administration, that John Hawkins had been reforming with considerable effectiveness since 1577, and a large number of armed merchant vessels, privateers, and volunteer ships whose contribution to the defensive force was as important as the Royal Navy's own. The Queen's ships were, in several respects, technically superior to the Spanish ones, and the nature of that superiority is worth understanding carefully because it determined much of what happened in the Channel. English warships in the 1580s had been evolving toward a design that emphasised long-range artillery. They were lower in the water than the great Spanish galleons, more manoeuvrable, and equipped with a higher proportion of culverins, the long-barrelled cannon that could project iron balls with greater accuracy and at greater distance than the shorter-range Spanish artillery. Spanish naval doctrine, shaped by the experience of Mediterranean galley warfare, emphasised closing with the enemy and boarding. The idea was to bring your men aboard the enemy ship and fight it out as a land battle at sea, which was where the Spanish tercio soldiers who filled the Armada's troop complement were genuinely formidable. English naval doctrine, developed partly in response to the scale advantages that Spain always enjoyed, emphasised staying at distance and pounding the enemy with long-range artillery, avoiding the boarding engagement where Spanish troop numbers would tell decisively. The tactical difference between these two doctrines would shape every engagement of the Armada campaign. The commander of the English fleet was Charles Howard, Lord Howard of Effingham, the Lord High Admiral, a distinguished nobleman with genuine administrative and organisational ability, who was not, in personal terms, primarily a fighting sailor. He was, however, wise enough to keep Francis Drake close. Drake, Vice Admiral of the fleet, the terror of the Spanish Main, the second Englishman to circumnavigate the globe, a man whose name in Spanish was El Drac, and whose reputation among the sailors of Spain was somewhere between a fearsome enemy and a supernatural figure, was the most experienced naval commander England had, and the one whose combination of tactical aggression and strategic boldness most naturally complemented the Armada's threat. Howard and Drake would work together with a degree of mutual respect and complementary ability that produced, in the 2 weeks of the Channel campaign, a naval command relationship that was considerably more functional than the divided and complicated command structure on the Spanish side. The decades of English privateering that preceded the Armada require more than a summary, because they were not merely provocations but a systematic economic and strategic campaign that accumulated into one of the causes of the enterprise of England. The distinction between a privateer and a pirate, as we have noted elsewhere in this channel's history, was the letter of Mag, the royal commission that authorised a private captain to attack the shipping and possessions of a specific enemy nation and keep a share of what he captured. Elizabeth's government maintained a careful ambiguity about the commissions it issued, authorising attacks on Spanish shipping in ways that provided legal deniability when Spain complained through diplomatic channels, while ensuring that the raids continued and their revenues flowed partly to the Crown through the Admiralty's prize system. John Hawkins had been the pioneer of the English Caribbean trade in the 1560s, making 3 voyages to West Africa and the Caribbean in which he traded enslaved Africans to Spanish colonial buyers in defiance of Spain's monopoly laws, a business that was simultaneously a violation of Spanish commercial sovereignty and an early and shameful participation in the Atlantic slave trade. The third of these voyages ended disastrously in 1568, when Hawkins and the young Drake, who sailed with him, were surprised in the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua by a Spanish fleet that violated the truce that had allowed the English to shelter in the harbour. Most of the English ships were sunk or captured. The survivors, including Hawkins and Drake, barely escaped. The experience shaped Drake's attitude towards Spain with a personal bitterness that gave his subsequent career a quality that went beyond simple commercial raiding. His circumnavigation of 1577 to 1580, only the second in history and the first commanded throughout by the same person who completed it, was partly a voyage of exploration and partly a raid on the Pacific coast of Spanish South America, which had never been attacked from the sea because no non-Spanish ship had ever managed to reach it before. The Pacific ports of Peru and Chile were completely unprepared for the arrival of an English privateer, and Drake plundered them with an ease and a thoroughness that produced a haul so enormous, an estimated 447,000 pesos of silver and gold, that Elizabeth's share of the proceeds, carefully maintained on the royal books, exceeded the Crown's total revenues for the entire preceding year. He was knighted on the deck of his ship, the Golden Hind, when he returned to Plymouth. Philip demanded his execution as a pirate. Elizabeth gave him a dinner party. Drake had done his best to preempt the Armada a year before it sailed. In April 1587, with a characteristically bold initiative that he justified to a somewhat alarmed Queen as offensive defence, he raided Cadiz harbour, where a significant portion of the Armada's supplies and equipment were being assembled, and destroyed or captured somewhere between 24 and 37 ships, along with enormous quantities of provisions. The raid, which Drake described in the phrase that became one of the great boasts of Elizabethan England as singeing the King of Spain's beard, delayed the Armada's departure by a year and degraded its logistics in ways that would prove consequential during the campaign. The seasoned barrel staves that were supposed to hold the Armada's provisions were destroyed at Cadiz and replaced with green wood that rotted during the voyage, spoiling large quantities of food and water at the worst possible moment. The experience of England in the weeks before the Armada's arrival, the watching and waiting, the preparation, the specific practical measures that ordinary English communities took in response to the approaching threat, is a part of the story that the drama of the naval engagement tends to overshadow, but it deserves attention because it was real and specific and human in ways that the grand strategic narrative is not. The trained bands, the local militia that was England's primary land defence, had been drilling through the spring and summer of 1588 with a seriousness that reflected the genuine alarm of the government's communications about the Armada's preparation. Every county was required to muster its able-bodied men, organise them into companies, and ensure that they had weapons and some rudimentary military training. The quality of what resulted varied enormously from county to county and from company to company, ranging from the relatively well-equipped and occasionally well-drilled units in the southern counties that had the most to fear from a landing to the more theoretically organised units in the north. The professional officers who were supposed to train and lead the trained bands were thin on the ground, and the weapons available were a mixture of firearms, pikes, bills, and whatever else the county arsenals contained, often in worse condition than the muster record suggested. The coastal communities of the south of England, the fishing villages and small ports of Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, and Sussex that would have been the first to feel the impact of a Spanish landing, had a particular and concrete experience of the approaching crisis. These were communities whose men were often at sea anyway, whose relationship with the Spanish was shaped by the privateering wars and the Atlantic trade, and who understood in a specific and practical way what a Spanish fleet in the Channel meant. The beacon watch that ran along the headlands and hilltops was maintained by local men, sometimes farmers and sometimes fishermen, who stood in the summer nights watching the horizon for the approaching sails that might or might not appear, and whose appearance, when it came, was both the thing they had been dreading and the thing their vigil was for. The psychological preparation of England for the Armada's arrival was managed by Elizabeth with the theatrical intelligence that was one of her most consistent political gifts. She was a woman who understood ceremony and symbolic communication with unusual sophistication, and she deployed both in the service of projecting the image of a monarch whose calm confidence in the outcome was itself a political message to her people and a diplomatic signal to every observer watching from the continent. England's response to the approaching crisis also had a specifically local and communal texture that the national narrative tends to abstract. Parish churches across the country held days of prayer as the Armada approached. Sermons were preached that combined the specific geography of the crisis, the Channel, the Armada's approach, the trained bands at Tilbury, with the theological framework that gave it meaning in the Protestant imagination. This was a new Israel defending itself against Pharaoh, a new Gideon facing the Midianites, a small and righteous people sustained by God against an overwhelming and ungodly power. The biblical parallels were not decorative. They were the conceptual framework through which most English people understood what was happening, and the subsequent Protestant interpretation of the victory as divine deliverance was not a post hoc construction, but a direct continuation of the interpretive framework that had been in place before the victory occurred. The speech she delivered at Tilbury in August 1588, as the Armada campaign was reaching its crisis, is one of the most celebrated pieces of political oratory in the English language. The words she was reported to have spoken to the troops assembled on the Essex shore varying slightly depending on which account you trust, but converging on the essential claim: I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Whether she said exactly those words is a question the historical record cannot fully settle. That she said something of that effect, that she was there in person rather than safely removed from any possibility of danger, and that the effect on the men who heard her was powerful. These things are well attested. Before we follow the fleet into the Channel, it is worth pausing on what life inside the Armada actually was, what it meant to be one of the 30,000 men aboard those ships in the spring and summer of 1588, because the drama of the campaign is the drama of specific human beings in specific physical circumstances, not merely the clash of strategic abstractions. The great galleons that formed the Armada's fighting corps were impressive machines of war and deeply uncomfortable places to live in for extended periods. A large galleon like the Saint Martin was organised around the practical requirements of sailing and fighting, the gun decks where the cannon were mounted, the magazines where the powder and shot were stored, the sail handling positions distributed across the masts and the rigging, with the accommodation of the men who worked it, arranged around those requirements in ways that prioritised function over comfort with a ruthlessness that the men living with the result found unsurprising but not pleasant. Officers had cabins aft, ranging from the relative spaciousness of the admiral's quarters to the cramped closets of junior officers. The soldiers and sailors who made up the bulk of the crew slept where they could, on the gun decks, in the hold, in the spaces between equipment, with no hammocks in most cases, no privacy, no consistent provision for the basic necessities of human existence beyond what the ship's discipline and the ship's chaplains provided. The food was the immediate physical reality for most men. The Armada's provisioning, as we have noted, had been compromised by the destruction of the seasoned barrel staves at Cadiz and their replacement with green wood that rotted. By the time the fleet sailed, and certainly by the time it entered the Channel, significant quantities of the biscuit and salt beef and dried fish that were supposed to sustain 30,000 men for months were already spoiled or spoiling. The water in the casks was going bad. The wine, a daily ration for soldiers and sailors of the period, more reliable than water as a source of calories, and less likely to produce the intestinal diseases that contaminated water caused, was also deteriorating. Men who were already physically stressed by the storms in the Bay of Biscay and the anxiety of an unprecedented military enterprise were eating and drinking provisions of declining quality in conditions that would have produced disease even if the food had been perfect. Disease was killing men aboard the Armada before the fighting started. The fevers that ran through crowded ships in warm weather, typhus, dysentery, and the various other illnesses that the medical knowledge of the period lumped together under general categories of sickness, were reducing the effective strength of the Armada's fighting crews before the first English gun was fired. Medina Sidonia's correspondence with Philip during the weeks the fleet waited in Corunna for repairs after the initial storms is full of specific clinical detail about the number of sick men, the shortage of medicines, the mortality already occurring among the soldiers and sailors. He was not complaining. He was reporting with the administrative conscientiousness that was his most reliable quality the condition of the enterprise that had been placed in his hands. The condition was not good. The priests and chaplains who sailed with the Armada, every ship had at least one, and the larger vessels had several, were there not merely for the spiritual ministration that soldiers facing combat required, but as an expression of the enterprise's specifically religious character. This was a crusade, blessed by the Pope, understood by Philip and most of those who participated in it, as a holy war authorised by God and conducted in his service. The daily Mass, the evening prayers, the general confession offered before the engagement with the English fleet. These were not optional supplementary activities, but constitutive elements of what the Armada was. The theological understanding that the men carried into the Channel with them shaped their experience of both the fighting and the failure in ways that secular military analysis alone cannot capture. The Armada sailed from Lisbon in May 1588. It was, in terms of sheer scale, unlike anything the Atlantic had ever seen. The fleet that left Portugal numbered approximately 130 ships, carrying perhaps 30,000 men, soldiers, sailors, clergy, and the servants and craftsmen whose skills were required to maintain such a force at sea over an extended voyage. The ships ranged from the great galleons that were the Armada's fighting corps, the massive San Martin, Medina Sidonia's flagship, displacing over 1,000 tons and carrying more than 40 cannon, through the merchant vessels pressed into service as supply ships and troop transports, to the Zabras and Pataches, the small fast vessels used for communication and scouting. The fleet carried months of provisions, though the spoilage from the Greenwood barrels was already beginning before it cleared Portuguese waters. It carried siege artillery for the land campaign that would follow the landing. It carried relics and religious images, because this was a crusade as well as a military expedition, and the men aboard it understood themselves to be doing God's work with the seriousness that understanding required. The sailing was almost immediately complicated by weather. Storms in the Bay of Biscay damaged ships, scattered the fleet, and forced a return to Corunna in northern Spain for repairs and resupply that consumed weeks. The delay was demoralising. The provisions were already showing the effects of poor preservation. Men were falling sick in numbers that alarmed the fleet's physicians. Medina Sidonia wrote again to Philip, explaining the fleet's condition with the same unflinching honesty that had characterised his acceptance letter, and suggesting again that the enterprise might best be postponed. Philip replied, again, that God would provide. The fleet sailed again in late July. It entered the English Channel on July 30th, the new calendar, and the English lookouts on the Cornish headlands who spotted the vast armada of sails on the western horizon lit the signal beacons that ran in a relay across England. The famous beacon chain that carried the news from Cornwall to London in hours, one of the most romantic images in the entire national mythology of 1588. The engagement that followed across the next 2 weeks was not the classic sea battle that popular imagination tends to picture. the two great fleets crashing together in a decisive test of force. It was something more frustrating, more tactical, and in its way more interesting than that. The Armada maintained a tight defensive crescent formation as it sailed up the channel, its flanks curved back to present a continuous wall of ships to any attacker. The weaker transport vessels sheltered in the centre, the great fighting galleons at the tips of the crescent where they could bring their weight of fire to bear on any attacker who tried to break through. The English fleet harassed the flanks repeatedly, firing from a distance that kept them beyond the range at which the Spanish could effectively grapple and board, but the Armada's formation held. The English gunnery did some damage, masts struck, hulls holed, men killed and wounded, but did not sink galleons or break the formation. The Spanish guns, firing at the same long range, did little damage to the English ships, partly because the English manoeuvring kept them at a distance the Spanish artillery was not optimised for, and partly because the Spanish gunners, trained in the boarding action tradition that prioritised closing rather than sustained long-range fire, were less practised at the precise long-range gunnery that the English excelled at. The English faced a tactical problem that they could not immediately solve. They could harass the Armada, but they could not stop it. The Armada was making its way up the channel toward the rendezvous with Parma, and if that rendezvous succeeded, the tactical calculus would change decisively. Parma's army of 17,000 veterans was a force that no English field army could reliably stop, and the defence of the channel was the last real line of English resistance. The English needed to break the Armada's formation before it could achieve the rendezvous. But every attempt to get close enough to deliver crippling blows risked the boarding engagement that English doctrine and English ship design was designed to avoid. There were skirmishes off Plymouth as the Armada passed. The famous story of Drake finishing his game of bowls on Plymouth Hoe before going down to his ships being, most likely, a piece of mythology invented after the fact, but carrying within it the authentic cultural truth that Drake's public equanimity in the face of danger was a real quality that contemporaries remarked on. There was a harder engagement off Portland Bill on August 2nd, where the Armada's flanking galleons attempted to close with the English ships, and came close enough that the fighting was genuinely dangerous for both sides, with the English fleet using every point of sailing advantage their ships possessed to stay at the distance where their gunnery could work and the Spanish boarding parties could not. There was an engagement off the Isle of Wight on August 4th that produced the clearest moment of Spanish tactical success in the entire campaign, when Medina Sidonia, reading the wind and current correctly, almost succeeded in getting the Armada into the relatively sheltered waters of the Solent, which would have given the fleet an anchorage and a position from which the rendezvous with Parma could potentially have been arranged. The English recognised the danger and fought hard to drive the Armada past the island and away from the Solent. They succeeded. The Armada continued up the channel. By the time the Armada reached Calais roads on August 6th and anchored there, the fundamental strategic problem of the enterprise of England had become apparent in a way that Medina Sidonia's communications with Parma were making uncomfortably clear. Parma's army was ready to embark, but Parma's embarkation required transport barges that were currently sheltering in the shallow Flemish harbours, Dunkirk, Newport, and those harbours were under blockade by a Dutch flyboat fleet, shallow-drafted vessels perfectly suited to operating in the sandbar-studded coastal waters where the Spanish galleons could not go. The Armada could not reach Parma because it drew too much water to enter the harbours where Parma's barges were. Parma's barges could not come out to the Armada because the Dutch would destroy them in the open water before the Armada could protect them. The rendezvous, which was the operational hinge on which the entire enterprise of England turned, was not achievable under the conditions that actually existed. Medina Sidonia and Parma exchanged increasingly urgent messages across the few days that the Armada lay anchored at Calais, and those messages make painful reading in hindsight. Two very capable men on either side of an unbridgeable gap, each doing everything the situation allowed and neither being able to change the fundamental geographic and naval reality that prevented the operation from working. The gap between the plan and the situation was not one that human effort could close, and then the English took the decision that converted the Armada's tactical stalemate into a genuine crisis. The fire ships were the decisive stroke of the Channel campaign, and their execution on the night of August 7th to 8th was a display of tactical ruthlessness, calibrated specifically to the Spanish fleet's vulnerability. 8 English ships were filled with combustible materials, their guns double-loaded so that they would fire as the heat of the flames reached them and sent drifting toward the anchored armada on a favourable wind and tide. Fire at sea was the most feared catastrophe of the naval world. Wooden ships, tarred rigging, canvas sails, gunpowder in the magazines, and the Spanish Navy had particular reason to fear it, because only a year before, the Spanish had been devastated by Italian fireships at the Battle of the Azores. Medina Sidonia had planned against this possibility. He had stationed pinnaces ahead of the fleet with orders to grapple the fireships and tow them away before they could reach the anchored galleons. The pinnaces tried. They managed to deflect 2 of the 8 fireships away from the fleet. The other 6 came on, blazing, their guns beginning to fire randomly as the heat reached them, drifting through the darkness toward the mass of anchored ships. And the Armada panicked. Not all of it, and not permanently. Medina Sidonia's flagship held its position, and the admiral managed to rally a portion of the fleet the following morning. But the panic of that night caused the majority of the Armada to cut their anchor cables, losing the anchors they would desperately need to hold position later, and scatter into the open North Sea, breaking the tight defensive formation that had been the fleet's primary protection throughout the Channel Passage. The engagement that followed on August 8th, off the Flemish port of Gravelines, was the decisive military confrontation of the campaign. The English closed to short range for the first time, close enough for their gunnery to do real damage rather than the superficial punishment they'd been inflicting at longer range, and hammered the scattered and partially disorganised Spanish ships for hours. Several galleons were sunk or driven onto the Flemish shoals, where they grounded and were lost. The San Mateo and the San Felipe were taken, their crews killed or captured. Other ships were hulled repeatedly, taking on water, their guns damaged, their crews reduced by casualty and exhaustion. The Spanish fought back with genuine courage. The tercios aboard the fighting galleons were not broken men, and they worked their guns and managed their ships under fire with the discipline of soldiers who knew how to fight even in desperate situations. But the tactical situation was beyond recovery. The Armada could not reform its crescent, could not achieve the rendezvous with Parma, could not execute any element of the plan that had brought it to the Channel. What saved the Armada from complete destruction at Gravelines was not Spanish valour, though there was Spanish valour. It was a shift in the wind, and the very real fear in Howard's fleet that they were running short of ammunition. The English had been firing throughout the Channel campaign at a rate that their magazines, stocked for a different kind of engagement, had not fully anticipated, and by the afternoon of August 8th, the English gunnery was becoming sporadic as powder, and shot ran low. Howard called off the attack. The Armada, battered and scattered, drifted north before the wind. The English followed for 2 days, shepherding rather than attacking, driving the Spanish fleet further north and further away from any possibility of returning to the Channel. Then the wind shifted again, and Howard turned his fleet back toward England. The immediate crisis was over, but the Armada was not yet finished. Medina Sidonia had no choice but to try to get what remained of his fleet home, and the only route available was the one that the wind and the English fleet had pushed him toward, north around Scotland and west around Ireland, back to Spain through the Atlantic. It was the long way home by a very long way, through waters that offered little shelter, in ships that were damaged, in the autumn season when the North Atlantic was beginning its deterioration toward the vicious storms of winter. The decision was made, and the fleet turned north. What happened on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland between August and October of 1588 was not a naval engagement. It was something that combined natural catastrophe with human suffering on a scale that the triumphalist English narrative of 1588 has consistently struggled to incorporate, because the suffering that the storms caused was too real, too specifically human, and too visibly involving people who were not England's enemies in any personal sense, for the clean story of Protestant providence defeating Catholic arrogance to fully contain it. The route north that the Armada was forced to take, up the east coast of England, around the northern tip of Scotland, and then south through the waters west of the Hebrides, the Outer Hebrides, the Orkney Islands, was a route that added thousands of miles to a voyage already intended to cross one ocean, and that passed through waters whose weather, even in high summer, was more severe than anything the Mediterranean experienced navigators of the Armada had trained for. The charts available for the northern waters were inadequate for safe navigation by the standards of the period, which were already imprecise. The almanacs and tide tables for the Irish coast were either unavailable or unreliable. The Armada's pilots, the specialists responsible for navigating in unfamiliar waters, were primarily Mediterranean men who had little experience of the North Atlantic and who were working from a combination of inadequate information and professional anxiety as the fleet made its way around a coastline they did not know. The instructions that Medina Sidonia distributed to the fleet before it turned north have survived and are one of the most poignant documents of the campaign. A detailed series of practical navigational instructions urging the ships to stay well out to sea, to allow a wide margin of distance from the Irish coast, to avoid the shallow banks and rocky headlands that the pilots knew were there even if they did not know precisely where. The instructions were good as far as they went. They could not account for the storms that drove ships far off their intended courses and onto coasts they had been warned to avoid. They could not account for the missing anchors, lost at Calais when the fireship panic caused the fleet to cut its cables, that might have allowed storm-tossed ships to hold position rather than being driven onto the rocks. They could not account for the specific combination of damage, exhaustion, and bad luck that made the weeks off Scotland and Ireland so catastrophic. The individual stories of the wrecks are the most humanly immediate part of the entire Armada narrative, and they survive in fragments across a range of sources: Spanish ships' logs, Irish annals, English administrative reports, and the remarkable memoir that Francisco de Cuellar wrote after his survival of 3 months in Ireland. Cuellar was a senior captain who had been placed under arrest during the Channel campaign for allowing his ship to break formation, a disciplinary action that his subsequent experience in the Irish adventure would have seemed an excessive punishment for. His ship, the San Pedro, was wrecked on the Sligo coast in late September. He survived the wreck, made his way onto the shore, and then began the odyssey that his memoir records with a specificity and vividness that no abstract account of the campaign can equal, hiding in ditches while English soldiers searched the beach, being helped by an Irish chieftain's wife who recognised him as a person in need and took a significant personal risk to shelter and feed him, crossing the country on foot through the autumn rains, eventually reaching the territory of another Irish lord who provided shelter while Cuellar found his way to Scotland and thence to a ship to Flanders. It was a natural catastrophe visited upon a force that had already been militarily defeated and was trying merely to survive the journey home. The North Atlantic autumn of 1588 was one of the stormiest on record, and the Armada's damaged ships, many of them missing the anchors lost at Calais, and all of them carrying sick, exhausted and hungry men, were driven by successive storms onto the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, with results that the casualty figures preserve in rough outline, but that the individual accounts of survival and loss capture with a human precision that the numbers cannot. The west coast of Ireland was the graveyard of the Armada's last hope. Storm after storm drove ships onto the rocky coast of Connaught and Munster, onto the shores of Clare and Galway and Sligo and Donegal, and the men who survived the wrecking then faced the English administration of Ireland, which operated under instructions from London that made their situation almost as dangerous as the sea. The English Lord Deputy Fitzwilliam issued orders that any Armada survivors found in Ireland were to be executed, partly from the military calculation that allowing thousands of Spanish soldiers to remain alive and potentially organised on Irish soil was unacceptable, and partly from the fear that the Armada's arrival might serve as the catalyst for a general Irish rising against English rule that the island's perpetual discontent made a standing possibility. The orders were carried out. Some survivors were hunted down by English soldiers, others were killed by the Irish who found them, following the practical wisdom that sheltering Spanish soldiers in defiance of English orders carried risks that most communities could not afford. Some were not killed. Some were hidden, fed, guided to safety by Irish communities whose willingness to help was shaped by a combination of Catholic solidarity with the Spanish, traditional Irish codes of hospitality toward shipwrecked sailors, and in some cases purely practical sympathy for fellow human beings who were wet and starving and dying on their doorsteps. The stories that survive from this period, of individual Armada soldiers hidden by Irish families, of men who made it overland to the Scottish Highlands and thence eventually to France or Spain, of the handful who escaped through extraordinary chains of charity and luck, are some of the most remarkable survival stories in the entire saga. One of the most famous is that of Francisco de Cuellar, a Spanish captain who survived the wreck of his ship on the Sligo coast and made his way across Ireland aided by various Irish lords, hiding in bogs and forests and impoverished farmhouses, eventually reaching Scotland and from Scotland a ship to Flanders, and who afterward wrote an account of his adventures that is one of the most vivid and personal documents of the entire Armada story. The precise number of ships and men lost in the storms off Scotland and Ireland is still debated by historians working from the Spanish archives, the English records, and the Irish annals that preserve fragments of local memory. The best current estimates suggest that roughly 63 of the Armada's original 130 ships made it back to Spain. The others were lost at sea, wrecked on the British coasts, or too damaged to complete the voyage. The number of men who died at sea in the storms, on the Irish coast of disease and starvation during the voyage, was probably somewhere between 10 and 15,000. Of the approximately 30,000 who had sailed from Lisbon in May, fewer than half returned. The ships that did make it home arrived in the ports of Spain through September and October of 1588, in a condition that shocked observers who had expected either victory or clean defeat, but had not quite imagined the particular horror of a fleet destroyed by weather rather than battle. Philip II received the news of the Armada's failure in his study at the Escorial, the great monastery palace he had built in the mountains northwest of Madrid, and his reported response was the most famous phrase associated with the entire episode. "I sent my ships to fight against men, not the winds and waves of God." Whether he said exactly this is uncertain. The earliest clear source for the phrase is later than 1588, and may be a post hoc construction. But what is well attested is that Philip's response to the disaster was neither collapse nor denial, but the kind of determined, controlled grief that his deep religious faith provided a framework for. He had believed that God authorized the enterprise of England. He now had to understand what God's failure to make it succeed meant. His theology provided an answer. The Armada had failed not because God had changed sides, but because Spain had been unworthy of divine favour, or because God's plan operated on a longer timescale than human impatience could see, or because the particular sins of the participants had forfeited the protection that a truly holy crusade would have enjoyed. He continued to plan against England. He would send 2 more armadas in 1596 and 1597, both of which were also dispersed by storms before they could reach the English coast. The enterprise of England never ceased being a project Philip believed in. It simply never succeeded. England's response to the Armada's defeat was immediate, sustained, and rather glorious in its self-congratulation, which is not a criticism, because the relief was genuine, the danger had been real, and the manner of the victory, whatever its actual causes, was sufficiently providential-looking to inspire the specific kind of national pride that the event generated. The medal struck to commemorate the victory. He blew, and they were scattered, flavit et dissipati sunt, attributed the outcome to divine intervention in a form that Elizabeth's government found theologically satisfying and rhetorically useful. The storms, in this interpretation, were not mere weather. They were the action of a God who had chosen England's side, which was the same message that Philip's theology had been sending his own side before the campaign began, and the irony of both sides claiming the same divine authorization with equal sincerity was the kind of thing that only appears ironic in retrospect. Before we assess the practical consequences of the Armada's defeat, it is worth taking the threat it represented seriously and specifically, not in the generic terms of the Protestant national mythology, but in the concrete terms of what a successful Spanish landing and English conquest would have actually meant for the people living in England in 1588. The English Protestant imagination of 1588 had a very specific image of what Spanish rule meant, and that image was not purely propaganda. It was based on documented reality. The Duke of Alba's Council of Blood in the Netherlands, which had executed thousands of people and driven tens of thousands into exile in the decade following the revolt of 1566, was a recent event within living memory. John Fox's Acts and Monuments, the enormous illustrated martyrology published in 1563 and reprinted in multiple editions, now known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, had given English Protestants a detailed and emotionally powerful account of the Marian persecution of the 1550s, when nearly 300 Protestants had been burned for heresy under the reign of Philip's wife Mary I. The Spanish Inquisition, which functioned in the Spanish Empire as an instrument not only of religious conformity, but of political control, was a reality whose methods and outcomes were not unknown in England. The story of England reconquered by Spain was not, in the imagination of 1588, a story of religious difference managed diplomatically. It was a story of fires and wrack and the systematic destruction of the Protestant settlement that most English people had come to regard as simply what England was. This fear was not unreasonable. Parma's army, whatever its military excellence, included the instruments of Spanish colonial governance that would have been applied to England in the aftermath of conquest, and Philip's plans for the post-conquest settlement, to the extent that they can be reconstructed from the surviving documentation, did not contemplate a tolerant multiculturalism that would leave the Protestant establishment largely intact. The restoration of Catholicism was the point. The Inquisition was a standard instrument of that restoration. The English who remembered Smithfield were not being neurotic. They were extrapolating from the known record of what Spanish religious policy looked like in practice. The ordinary English villagers and townspeople who watched the beacon fires run across the hills of England in late July 1588 knew, in the general sense, what was at stake. They may not have known the specific military details of the Armada's armament or the exact nature of the planned rendezvous with Parma, but they knew that a Catholic fleet was coming, that Elizabeth's government was treating the situation as a national emergency of the First Order, and that the consequences of failure would be visible in their own lives in ways that most of them did not want to contemplate too specifically. The mobilisation of the trained bands, the local militia forces that were the primary instrument of English land defence in this period, reflected this popular understanding. The men who assembled at Tilbury were not professional soldiers. They were farmers and craftsmen and tradesmen who had been called up to defend something they understood viscerally, even if they could not articulate it in the language of geopolitics. The practical consequences of the Armada's defeat were both more and less than contemporaries appreciated in the immediate aftermath. The immediate consequence was that England was not invaded, not reconverted to Catholicism, and not subordinated to Habsburg dominance, which was, given what the stakes had been, a consequence of the First Order. The Protestant Reformation's survival as a permanent feature of European religious life was not guaranteed solely by the Armada's failure. There were too many other contingencies in play across the following decades for any single event to determine the outcome of that larger historical question. But the Armada's failure removed the most concrete immediate threat to it, and the breathing space that removal provided was used by the Protestant states of Europe in ways that made the eventual settlement of the religious conflict more favourable to Protestantism than it would otherwise have been. The longer-term consequence was a shift in the balance of naval power in the Atlantic that played out across the following decades and was not immediately apparent in 1588. Spain remained the most powerful state in the world for another generation after the Armada. Its silver continued to flow from the Americas. Its armies continued to fight in the Netherlands, in France, and across the European theatre, with an effectiveness that no other state could match. English celebrations of the Armada's victory were somewhat premature in their implication that England had replaced Spain as the dominant Atlantic power. That replacement would take most of the following century to accomplish. But the direction of travel had shifted. The aura of Spanish invincibility that had been one of the most important instruments of Habsburg power, the sense that opposing Spain militarily was futile, that the most powerful state on earth would eventually prevail against any combination of lesser powers, was damaged by 1588 in ways that the Dutch rebels and the French Huguenots and every other party to the various conflicts with Spain noted and drew conclusions from. The English naval tradition that the Armada campaign helped crystallise, the emphasis on long-range gunnery, on manoeuvre rather than boarding, on the use of the weather gauge to maintain tactical advantage, became the foundation of a naval doctrine that would sustain English and later British maritime power through the following centuries. The experience of 1588 was not immediately convertible into permanent naval supremacy. The Elizabeth government's financial constraints meant that the fleet that had defeated the Armada was quickly reduced and allowed to decay. John Hawkins' reforms of the naval administration, which had produced the technically superior warships of 1588, required sustained investment to maintain, and sustained investment required parliamentary approval that the Queen's fiscal conservatism did not always seek or receive. But the knowledge was there, the doctrine was established, and the tradition of the fighting sailor that Drake and Hawkins and Howard had demonstrated in the Channel became a cultural inheritance that the 17th and 18th centuries would build upon. The Channel campaign of late July and early August 1588 lasted 9 days between the Armada's first sighting off the Lizard Headland in Cornwall on July 30th and the fireship attack at Calais on the night of August 7th to 8th. And those 9 days were a sustained psychological as well as physical ordeal for both fleets. To understand what those 9 days were actually like, not in the strategic summary but in the experience of the men living through them, requires attending to the specific conditions of naval combat in the 16th century. The noise was the first thing. The guns of the period, the culverins and demi-culverins and cannon and demi-cannon that filled the gun decks of both fleets, were loud beyond the ability of people who have never been near them to easily imagine. Each firing produced a concussive blast that could be felt as physical pressure in the chest at close range and heard from miles away across the water. A full broadside from a large galleon was 50, 60, 100 guns firing in rapid sequence, and the sustained exchange of fire between several ships produced a continuous rolling thunder that the men inside it experienced as an environment of noise so total that individual commands could not be heard over it, and the only communication that worked was gesture and prearranged signals. Men went deaf in combat, temporarily and sometimes permanently. The smoke from black powder was dense and acrid, accumulating in the gun decks faster than the wind could disperse it through the gun ports, so that the men working the guns worked in a haze that stung the eyes and thickened the air and made the already chaotic interior of a fighting ship even harder to navigate. The physical labour of working a large cannon in the 16th century was enormous. A culverin firing ball might weigh 4,000 pounds or more. After each firing, the gun had to be swabbed out with a damp sponge on a long pole to extinguish any remaining sparks, recharged with powder from the magazine. A job that required carrying cartridges from below, through the smoke and confusion, to the gun deck above. The shot rammed home. The gun run back out through the gun port and the firing sequence repeated. A well-drilled gun crew of the period could fire twice in 3 minutes under ideal conditions. Combat conditions were not ideal, and the rate of fire fell off sharply as the engagement continued, and the men tired, and the supply line from the magazine became congested with casualties and confusion. The English crews were somewhat better drilled in sustained gunnery than the Spanish, whose doctrine of closing and boarding required less emphasis on sustained long-range fire, and this difference in training and in the physical stamina required to maintain it accumulated over the 9 days of the Channel campaign into a genuine tactical advantage. The English fleet's ammunition crisis at Gravelines was a consequence of the rate of fire that the Channel engagements had required. The English magazines had been stocked for the kind of engagement that was expected, a series of short, sharp actions, not for 9 days of continuous harassment and then a prolonged close-range battle. By August 8th, the powder and shot that Howard's fleet had carried from Plymouth was substantially depleted, and the shortage was constraining the rate of fire at precisely the moment when close-range engagement had finally become possible. The English fired what they had, and then, when the Armada's northward drift and the windshift gave them the opportunity to break off, they did so, returning to resupply before following north to ensure the Armada did not turn back. The men who fought the Armada were not uniformly heroic, though some of them were genuinely heroic in ways that the historical record preserves with sufficient clarity to respect. Francis Drake's tactical aggressiveness throughout the campaign was real and important. Howard's management of the overall fleet, keeping a difficult coalition of royal and private vessels functioning as a coherent force under pressure, was a genuine organisational achievement. The ship captains who closed to short range at Gravelines, bringing their vessels into the zone where the Spanish could grapple and board, knowing that the risk was real and proceeding anyway because the tactical situation required it, these men were brave in the specific literal sense of the word. They were also, some of them, driven by motivations that the patriotic narrative tends to underemphasize. The prize money from captured Spanish ships was a significant incentive for the privateers who made up a large portion of the English fleet, and the behaviour of certain English captains during the campaign, breaking off attacks on damaged Spanish vessels to take them as prizes rather than continuing to fight, was criticised at the time and tells you something about the mixture of national duty and personal profit that animated the defence. Drake himself was accused of this at one point during the campaign, the accusation referring to his leaving his station in pursuit of a Spanish ship he had spotted separately from the main fleet. He returned from the expedition with a captured Spanish galleon full of treasure, which was convenient for him personally, and which he dealt with diplomatically, but which was the subject of bitter complaint from other captains whose ships, left unlit during the night in which he was supposed to be showing his stern lantern as a guide, had scattered in confusion. His explanation for the pursuit, that he had seen unknown sails and gone to investigate for tactical reasons, was accepted officially. The whispers about the treasure were harder to silence. The ordinary sailors who crewed the English fleet have perhaps the best claim on the modern imagination's sympathy, because they suffered the consequences of the campaign's logistical failures in ways that the commanders who planned it did not. The English fleet supply system had not been designed for an extended campaign, and the ships that returned to port after the Armada's northward dispersal were filled with men who were sick, hungry, and in many cases dying from the same combination of inadequate food, contaminated water, and epidemic disease that had been killing men on the Armada throughout the campaign. Howard wrote to the government in August 1588, after the tactical victory, before the strategic euphoria had time to set in, describing the state of his men with a directness that makes uncomfortable reading. Men were dying for want of food and medicine. The pay that was owed to them was not forthcoming from a government that was already calculating the cost of the campaign against the Queen's revenues and finding the arithmetic alarming. Some men died in the ships, waiting for pay and provisions that came too late. Others were discharged sick onto the docks of Margate and Dover, with no provision for their welfare and no means of supporting themselves while they recovered. The contrast between the national celebration of the victory and the condition of the men who had won it was not lost on contemporaries, and it was noted in particular by Howard, who spent some of his own money on provisions for his men when the governments were not forthcoming. The experience of 1588 illuminated a persistent problem in the English state's relationship to its navy, the willingness to celebrate naval victory and the reluctance to pay for the forces that produced it, that would recur across the following centuries with a regularity that later naval historians found both infuriating and characteristic. The individual human stories on the Spanish side of the Armada deserve the same attention that the English national mythology has lavished on Drake and Howard and the English sailors, because they are equally specific and equally human and equally illuminating about what the campaign actually was. The men who served in the Armada were not abstractions of Catholic tyranny or symbols of Habsburg overreach. They were men who had signed on for a crusade that their king and their church had told them was the will of God, who had endured months at sea in terrible conditions, and who found themselves, those who survived, trying to understand what it meant that God had allowed the enterprise to fail. Miguel de Oquendo, one of the Armada's squadron commanders, commanded the Andalusian squadron with a courage and tactical skill that the Channel engagements demonstrated clearly. His ship, the Santa Ana, was badly damaged at Gravelines, and he sailed it north in the deteriorating condition that the subsequent weeks compounded, eventually limping back to the Basque coast of Spain after a voyage that would have killed lesser men and their crews. He died shortly after arriving home, and whether his death was from the physical consequences of the campaign or from something that the sources characterize as heartbreak, the phrase used by some accounts is impossible to determine, but the conjunction of survival and death is characteristic of the way the Armada destroyed men who did not die in it. Diego Flores de Valdés, Medina Sidonia's chief of staff, one of the senior officers most criticised in the post-campaign analyses conducted by the Spanish crown, became the target of much of the blame that the Spanish administration directed at the campaign's leadership, partly justly, and partly because someone needed to absorb the blame, and Medina Sidonia was too grand and too well connected to be a convenient target. He was imprisoned on his return, held for several years, and eventually released. The process of accountability that follows a military disaster always requiring, in bureaucracies of any era, the identification of individuals whose punishment can stand for the failure of a collective enterprise. The ordinary soldiers and sailors who made up the bulk of the Armada's 30,000, the men from Castile and Andalusia, and the Basque country and Portugal, from the Italian states whose subjects served in Spanish military formations, from the various other communities within the Habsburg Empire who contributed personnel to the great enterprise, returned to Spain, or did not return to Spain, and their individual experience of the campaign has largely dissolved into the statistical aggregate of the casualty figures. A few survive in the record because their cases came before the military administration in some form: claims for pay owed, petitions for recognition of service, the paperwork of military justice. But most are known only by their names on the muster rolls that the Spanish archives preserve in considerable quantity. Men who sailed from Lisbon in May 1588, and whose subsequent fate the rolls do not record. The Spanish who survived the Armada and made it back to Spain carried with them an experience that the triumphalist rhetoric of the enterprise had not prepared them for. The soldiers and sailors who had signed on for a crusade, who had believed that God would grant them victory as the just reward of holy warfare, returned to find that Philip's theology of continued faith provided an official explanation for the outcome that many of them found harder to inhabit than their king did. The physical condition of the returning men, sick, exhausted, many of them permanently damaged by the months at sea and the storms off Scotland and Ireland, was noted by observers in the Spanish ports. The mourning of families who did not see their men return was widespread. The financial cost of the Armada, which was staggering even by the standards of Philip's silver-backed finances, was felt across the Spanish economy in ways that the official narrative of providential delay and future promise could not entirely soothe. Medina Sidonia returned to Spain and to his estates in Andalusia, where he spent the remainder of his life managing his considerable properties and attempting to restore a reputation that the Armada campaign had, in the public perception, damaged significantly. Philip made no public criticism of his admiral's performance, which was probably just since the Armada's failure was not primarily Medina Sidonia's fault. He had done what was possible given the plan he had been given and the conditions he had encountered, which is as much as any commander can be asked. But the public perception, sharpened by the propaganda of the English victory celebration, and by the disappointed expectations of a nation that had been told it was on a holy crusade, was less generous than the Duke's actual record deserved. He lived until 1615, long enough to see two more armadas fail, and to understand that the enterprise of England, which had seemed so providentially certain in the spring of 1588, was not going to be accomplished in his lifetime, or as it turned out in anyone else's. The physical evidence of the Armada's passage and its destruction has been gradually recovered by archaeology across the past several decades in ways that add a dimension to the story that the written sources cannot provide. The wrecks that lie on the seabed off the Irish coast, the Girona off the Giant's Causeway in County Antrim, the Santa Maria de la Rosa in the Blasket Sound off Kerry, the La Trinidad Valenciera off Donegal, among others, have been excavated with varying degrees of completeness and have produced artefacts that connect the abstract numbers of the historical record to specific, individual human lives. The gold jewellery and personal ornaments recovered from the Girona, the jewelled salamander pendant, the gold rings, the beautiful cameos, were the personal possessions of men who had expected to be returning to Spain with the honour of crusaders, not dying on the rocks of the Irish coast. They are in the Ulster Museum in Belfast now, each piece evidence of a person who wore it, a life that ended in the cold water of a North Atlantic autumn. The cannons recovered from the wrecks have allowed naval historians to refine their understanding of the Armada's armament, to determine, more precisely than the documentary record alone permits, the actual distribution of gun types and calibers aboard different classes of Spanish vessel, and to test whether the received wisdom about the English long-range gunnery advantage accurately describes what actually happened. The conclusions are nuanced in ways that the straightforward victory narrative tends to flatten. The Spanish ships were not uniformly outgunned at long range, and the difference in gunnery effectiveness between the two fleets was real, but more complicated in its particulars than the traditional account suggests. What the archaeology confirms in its materiality is the reality of an event that the written sources describe, the physical evidence of cannon fire in the hull timbers, the shot embedded in the wreck structures, the small personal objects that tell the story of human lives that intersected with a moment of historical consequence, and were extinguished by it. The question of what the Armada meant, what its failure signified for the larger history of the period, has been answered in different ways by different generations of historians, and the answers have tended to reflect the preoccupations of the periods producing them as much as the historical reality of 1588. The Victorian British interpretation emphasised naval supremacy and Protestant providence, in ways that serve the self-understanding of an empire that traced its origins to the Elizabethan sea dogs. 20th century Spanish historians, working from the Spanish archives rather than from English sources, produced a counter-narrative that gave more credit to Medina Sidonia's actual performance and more weight to the weather as a cause of failure, reducing the English naval triumph to something closer to assisted luck than strategic superiority. More recent scholarship has tried to hold both perspectives in view simultaneously, to acknowledge the genuine tactical accomplishments of the English fleet while recognising that the decisive factors were weather and the impossible logistics of the rendezvous plan, and to understand the Armada not as a simple story of Protestant pluck defeating Catholic arrogance, but as a complex event produced by the intersection of religious passion, imperial strategy, financial constraint, and the unreliable North Atlantic autumn. The specific moment when the historical understanding of the Armada shifted most significantly was the 400th anniversary in 1988, which produced a wave of scholarly work that drew on the Spanish archives in ways that earlier English-dominated historiography had not. Geoffrey Parker and Colin Martin's The Spanish Armada, published that year, synthesised the documentary and archaeological evidence in a way that permanently changed the scholarly understanding of the campaign, establishing clearly that the Spanish gunnery had been less effective than previously assumed, not because of poor gun design, but because of the way the guns had been loaded in port, with the tackle wedged in ways that made in-battle adjustments to the angle of fire extremely difficult, a logistical failure that had nothing to do with the fighting qualities of the Spanish crews, and everything to do with the inadequate pre-sailing preparation. The book also drew on the archaeological evidence of the Irish wrecks to provide a picture of the Armada's armament that the documentary sources alone could not provide. The popular celebration of the anniversary in England in 1988 was, inevitably, somewhat less historically sophisticated than the scholarship. The anniversary was an occasion for national self-congratulation of the kind that significant historical anniversaries tend to produce, with the beacon chain relit on the headlands of southern England and the English Channel, sailed by replica vessels and the speeches made with the rhetoric that the occasion demanded. The Armada story was doing the cultural work it always does, confirming national identity, providing a precedent for small island resilience against continental power, offering a narrative framework in which the combination of Protestant faith and English valour could be celebrated simultaneously. That these elements of the mythology bore a complicated relationship to the historical reality, that the storms mattered more than the gunnery, that the rendezvous plan had been unworkable before the first shot was fired, that the English sailors died of disease and inadequate provisions in numbers that the celebrations did not dwell on, was not the concern of anniversary rhetoric, which operates on different terms than historical analysis. What this more complex reading leaves intact, however, is the basic historical reality that the Armada's failure mattered, that 1588 was genuinely one of those pivot points where the contingency of the moment was real enough that a different outcome was possible, and where the different outcome would have produced a different world. An England reconverted to Catholicism by Spanish military force, governing its Protestant population through the Inquisition's mechanisms, losing its position as the dominant Protestant power of the North. This was a possible world in the spring of 1588, in a way that it was not a possible world by the autumn. The storms off Ireland were not inevitable. The panic at the fireship attack was not inevitable. The English gunnery advantage, though real, was not necessarily sufficient to have prevented the rendezvous and the landing if other factors had been different. The Armada could have succeeded. It did not. And the world that did not come to be, the world of a Habsburg-dominated, Catholic-restored Atlantic, is the ghost that haunts the history of 1588 and gives the events of that summer their particular historical weight. Before we arrive at the cultural legacy, it is worth asking what the Armada's aftermath meant in the more immediate political and military terms for the following decade and a half, the period that runs from 1588 to Elizabeth's death in 1603, and that is sometimes misread as a straightforward triumph of Protestant England over Catholic Spain. The wars did not end in 1588. England and Spain remained in a state of conflict, undeclared but real, for another 16 years, and the English found over that period that defeating the Armada had not resolved the fundamental disparity of resources between the two countries. The counter-armada of 1589, in which Drake and Hawkins led a large English fleet to attack Spain and Portugal in the aftermath of the Armada's defeat, was a conspicuous failure. The fleet accomplished little at Corunna and Lisbon, and the attempt to install Dom Antonio as an alternative Portuguese claimant on the throne was a diplomatic and military embarrassment. The English attempt to capitalise on 1588 demonstrated that turning a defensive success into an offensive capability required resources and logistical capacity that England did not have. Spain rebuilt. Philip commissioned new and better designed ships after the Armada, learning from the tactical lessons of the Channel campaign, ships that were faster, that carried a higher proportion of long-range artillery, that addressed the specific weaknesses that English gunnery had exposed. The armadas of 1596 and 1597 that he sent toward England were dispersed by storms rather than defeated by English gunnery, which suggests that the naval balance of 1588 was not as decisively in England's favour as the national mythology implied. Both countries were exhausted by the late 1590s, and the peace that James I made with Spain in 1604, the year after Elizabeth's death, reflected a mutual recognition that the conflict had consumed resources neither side could afford to replace indefinitely. The island that the Armada's wrecks had touched was itself convulsed through the 1590s by the 9 Years' War, the most serious Irish rebellion of the Elizabethan period, led by Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell with Spanish support that arrived too late and in too limited quantities to change the outcome. But that demonstrated the persistent Spanish interest in using Ireland as a backdoor to England that the Armada's failure had not extinguished. The Battle of Kinsale in 1601, where a Spanish expeditionary force landed in southern Ireland and was defeated in combination with the Irish rebel forces by the English army, was in some ways the last act of the Armada drama. Spain's final serious military attempt to use Ireland as the means of threatening England, ending in failure at the same Irish coast where the Armada's wrecks lay on the seabed. The legacy of the Armada in English cultural memory is one of the most persistent and most productive in the national tradition, generating a continuous stream of commemoration, artistic response, and political invocation that runs from the medal struck in 1588 to the anniversary celebrations of the 20th century and beyond. The Armada portrait of Elizabeth I, the famous painting in which the Queen is depicted against a backdrop of the Armada's defeat, her hand resting on a globe in a gesture of imperial confidence, her gown embroidered with sea creatures, the two windows behind her showing the English fireships and the Spanish wrecks, with a narrative clarity that makes it one of the earliest examples of political painting in the modern sense, captured the moment's self-understanding with a sophistication that Elizabeth's court had been developing throughout her reign. She's not merely a queen who survived. She's the queen whose survival determined the shape of the world. The phrase that became the Armada's most durable popular summary, the Spanish fleet sailed in the form of a crescent to devour England and was devoured, is poetry rather than history, but it catches something real about the experience of 1588 as those who lived through it understood it, the scale of the threat, the totality of the reversal, the sense that something providential had occurred, whose significance exceeded what any merely military analysis could capture. The Armada's legacy in Spain is necessarily different, a story of a great enterprise that failed, of men who died in the service of a cause that God had not sustained as they had believed he would, of a country that remained the most powerful state in Europe for another generation, but that had learned, in the autumn of 1588, something about the limits of that power that it would take several more decades to fully internalize. The Spanish imperial tradition continued. The silver continued to flow. The armies continued to fight. But the particular quality of absolute confidence with which Philip had launched the enterprise of England, the certainty that a project sufficiently holy and sufficiently powerful was simply a project that God would cause to succeed, was one of the casualties of 1588, even if it took Philip himself years to acknowledge it. The coast of Ireland, where the wrecks lie, and the stories of survival and death have been preserved in local memory and in the oral tradition with a persistence that archaeology is beginning to confirm and enrich, is perhaps the most honest monument to the Armada's full meaning. The great galleons that lie in the sands of Donegal and Kerry were not symbols of Spanish pride destroyed by English valour. They were ships full of men, soldiers and sailors and priests and servants, most of them young, most of them frightened, most of them dying not in battle, but in a storm on an alien coast. And they are evidence, in their materiality and their wreck, of the human cost of the collision of imperial ambitions that the summer of 1588 produced. The Irish who sheltered some of them, and the Irish who killed others of them under English instructions, and the English soldiers who carried those instructions out, and the Spanish commanders who sailed north into the storms because there was no other way home, all of them were participants in an event that was simultaneously a political crisis, a military campaign, a religious war, and a natural disaster, and each of them experienced it in the specific, individual, bodily way that historical events are actually experienced by the people inside them, not in the summarizing, meaning-making way that posterity constructs around them afterward. The night is settling in now, and the long story of 1588 has reached its end, or the end of that particular chapter, because the consequences of the Armada ran forward into the 17th century and the 18th century, and arguably into the shape of the world today, through the Protestant states of Northern Europe and the Atlantic commercial system that England would eventually dominate, and the colonial histories that flow from that dominance. The threads run a long way from the summer of 1588. They run through the Dutch Republic and the English Civil War, and the Glorious Revolution, and the settlement of America, and the abolition of slavery and the making of the modern world. But tonight, in the specific moment of the story we have been telling, let the summer of 1588 be what it was. The beacon fires running across England in the July darkness, hill to hill, carrying the news from Cornwall to London in hours. The great fleet rounding the Lizard Headland and filling the channel from shore to shore, the largest thing the sea had ever held, the guns firing through the smoke and the smell of powder across the August water, English culverins at long range and Spanish guns at shorter range, neither quite getting what it needed from the exchange, the fireships burning through the Calais night, and the panic and the cut anchor cables and the formation breaking apart, the storm off Ireland, and the coast coming up out of the darkness and the rocks, the gold salamander pendant on the seabed, the men who came home and the men who did not. Let all of that settle into the quiet around you now. The Channel is dark tonight, and the Irish coast is dark, and the waters where the wrecks lie are cold and still. Elizabeth is 3 years dead in the painting, and 4 centuries dead in the ground, and still somehow present in the culture that she shaped, which is what it means to have been at the centre of a moment that mattered. Philip is in his Escorial, annotating his papers, his faith intact and his plans still being made, still working toward the enterprise of England in the long, patient, providential time frame that his theology provided. The world that came out the other side of 1588 is the world we live in. Its shape was not inevitable. It could have been different. It wasn't. The fireships went in, the storms came, the wrecks settled onto the seabed, and the contingency of the summer of 1588 resolved itself into the permanence of what actually happened. Rest easy.